This is the court reporter again. May I ask, I'm looking at the agenda. Is it just these four items for today?
Hi, this is Juliana speaking. Yes, we just have four agenda items today.
Okay, and just so I have a sense of how this works, there will be the review board and will there be applicants or something giving presentations and then the review board will ask questions, or how does this work?
Yes, exactly.
Okay,
So we'll probably get started in pretty promptly at 9. But we're just everything's all set up and good to go.
okay, great.
Good morning. Looks like we're waiting for a few more board members to join. Now have a quorum, so we'll get started. Good morning and welcome to the June 2nd meeting of the DC Historic Preservation Review Board. My name is Marnique Heath, the chair of the board. Public notice of this WebEx meeting and instructions for participating have been provided by email to the project applicants and the HPO mailing list, and also posted on the Office of Planning website. This meeting is being live streamed and archived on the Office of Planning's YouTube channel. Please be aware that if you're watching on YouTube, you will not be able to provide testimony. Those wishing to provide testimony must register in advance and join via WebEx. I'd like to ask each board member participating in today's meeting to turn on their cameras, and I'll do a roll call to identify who's present. Good morning, Board Member Auerbach. I see you. I don't know if you're having technical difficulties. Okay. Good morning. It sounds like your sound is breaking up, but you came through that time. Board Member Beatty.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Board Member Beatty present.
Good morning. Board Member Bell.
Good morning, Matt Bell present.
Good morning. We don't have Board Member Green or Horsey this morning with us, but I do see Board Member Jones.
Good morning, Board Member Jones here.
Good morning. And has Board Member Jowers Barber joined us yet? I do expect her this morning, so we'll announce her arrival once she does join. And then Board Member Failer.
Good morning, Chair Heath. Board Member Failer present.
Good morning. Since this is a continuation hearing from our meeting last Thursday, I will not read all of the procedural points again. And that means we can get right into our agenda for the morning. Our first case is in Mount Vernon Square Historic District at 1100 6th Street. Is staff ready to make your presentation?
Yes, I am, Madam Chair.
Excellent. Good morning, Brendan.
Good morning. Good morning, Madam Chair, other members of the board. My name is Brendan Meyer. I'm the Historic Preservation and Staff Reviewer for the Office for the Historic Preservation Office. And the case I'm presenting is at the property address of 1100 6th Street Northwest in the Mount Vernon Square Historic District. Case number 22-274. Bonstra Hairsign Architects, on behalf of the owner, seeks concept approval for a 4-story and a 7-story addition to the 1100 6th Street, which is a contributing property in the historic district. This site was originally 4 building lots that fronted on 6th Street, and these lots are now combined by subdivision into a single lot. The sole surviving historic building on the lot is a substantial 3-story gable-roofed house on the corner, which was originally constructed in 1855 for owner James Essex. The house was converted to commercial use in the 20th century and has several small additions from that era, including a corner projection, a 1-story side addition on 6th Street, and a 1-story CMU rear wing facing L Street. Prior to these alterations, Essex House originally had an attached house on its north side and a rear wing that was set back from L Street. In 2006, the house was extensively rehabilitated, including work on its interior framing, which was substantially replaced. Exterior walls were repointed, windows replaced, and a new roof was installed. Its front facade millwork at the front door and cornice was replaced with reconstructions based on historic photos. Today, the applicant proposes to build a project of new construction consisting of 2 distinct compositions and only some minor interior connections to Essex House. Facing on 6th Street, the project is conceived as 3-story projecting bay row houses connected to Essex House by a 2-story glass entrance. This new row would share a continuous 4th floor and a different material than the brick of the houses. On top of that would be a glass-railed uncovered roof deck. The second portion of the addition is a tower facing L Street. This would be 7 stories, running the full depth of the site to the north. And would be connected to Essex House with a 2-story glass entrance like the one proposed for 6th Street. All 3 sides of the tower, front and 2 sides, are articulated architecturally. There's a gridded front facade on L Street. This facade treatment wraps around to the east side and has further augmentations towards the rear. The west elevation is a series of apartment unit balconies. Between the 2 additions, Essex House would be lightly touched itself. The new construction would only be moderately connected to the historic house and its interior circulation, with some narrow openings at the 2nd and 3rd stories of the house. The connections would be minimal. The conditions of the site and its surrounding context are conducive to a wide range of options for a concept design compatible with the character of the historic district. There are a lot of options for this site. Essex House was substantially rehabilitated recently and so poses no vital preservation concerns at this time. The site gives ample room for new development. The site does not sit in an area sensitive to matters of scale and height because of the tall new construction to the south across the street on L Street. The non-contributing apartments to the west of the site erode somewhat the historic context of this part of the historic district. And the monumentally scaled church just to the north up 6th Street also adds to a context of some large scale. This project could be designed in any number of compatible ways, and the one presented by the applicant should be counted amongst those. While no major incompatibilities have been identified by staff, the board should or can discuss the following points, evaluate their sufficient compatibility, and advise the applicant in the board motion if any necessary revisions or conditions are necessary to make the project sufficiently compatible. And some examples of those aspects to consider. The projecting bay row house form that's been selected for 6th Street, this is a sound choice. The row house forms blend with the row houses that predominate up the street and throughout the historic district. And it's a good blend. The row houses as they're designed are 3-story houses with a contrasting contemporary 4th floor across the entire group. But in this case, 4-story row houses would work just as well in terms of compatibility. There's not much advantage gained by disguising the 4th floor as something different from the row houses below. So alternatively, rendering the 4th story as brick to match the material below of the proposed new row houses, or in fact as a mansard, while keeping the bays as 3-story elements, would produce a compatible composition in terms of scale and material that's very similar to the common type of massing found in historic row houses in the historic district. Another aspect to look at may be that the 2-story glass facades abutting the north and west sides of Essex House separate the new construction from the historic, giving it space to stand out. And there is definitely a design benefit to doing that. Alternatively, to the glass hyphens, the natural condition of the house was to be connected historically. It was connected historically on the north by another house that's no longer there. It was connected on the west with a rear wing. So the design does not need to stand off from the house. The natural condition on the house was to be attached. So that's an option. It does have its own pitfalls of how to connect with the historic roof of the house, so that's avoided by using the glass hyphens. And again, the glass hyphens certainly provide some benefit to the concept design. But there all are alternatives if the board wants to explore that. And lastly, the east elevation of the 7-story addition, which fronts on L Street, but then goes all the way back to the north end of the site. This long east elevation is essentially going to be a backdrop to the Essex House. And it is an articulated facade, and that's a worthwhile treatment. There are some aspects of how developed the ornamentation is of the east elevation. There are towards the rear and top of this elevation, there are some pronounced fins or in fact what looks like clips that look like they're holding down the top story. Articulating the east elevation is a very worthwhile part of the project, but the board may want to consider the tone of how developed that is, and a more muted treatment might create a backdrop to Essex House that competes less with the house. So that's a fine scale detail of how this design is treated in this location. So those are three general areas to look at for an otherwise very compatible concept design for new construction. And so the HPO recommends that the board find the 4-story and 7-story additions to 1100 6th Street to be compatible with the character of the historic district, consistent with the purpose of the Preservation Act, provide direction to the applicant for any revisions necessary as conditions of approval, and that final approval be delegated to staff. Thank you. I'm available for questions.
Great. Thank you, Brendan. Is the applicant ready to make your presentation?
I certainly am.
Excellent. You can proceed.
Okay. My name is Robert Tinsel. I'm an architect with Bonster Harrison Architects, and I will run us through this presentation very quickly so that we can get to the discussion. So as mentioned, the site is located in this little red square down here in the Mount Vernon Historic District. And we can go to the next slide. And as mentioned, there was also the historic building and the non-historic additions, including the non-historic bay window addition on the corner of 6th and L. Next slide. So here's just some pictures of the context which we were studying so that we could get a better idea of how to more seamlessly fit into and be compatible with the existing context. So as mentioned, there's very large scale modern development just to the south with the office building across the street, as well as further down south with all the 10 and 11-story apartment buildings. And then further north as well as east, we have a lot of historic existing row houses. Next slide, please. So the current state of the existing building, which as mentioned has been cleaned up and preserved. So what we will be doing is trying to take that back up to the best level possible so that we can preserve the historic building, including, as mentioned, removing this non-historic corner bay so that we can bring it back to its original state, and removing the non-historic single-story additions here. Next slide. So just zooming in on a little bit of the details here. So also, as Brendan mentioned, this will all be preserved and brought back to the most original state that we could bring it. So it'll be replaced, or well, the windows have been replaced, but we'll be making sure that if we need to do that again, we will be doing that. But otherwise, removing the bay here and then trying to stay back from the building just a little bit so that we can really accentuate the historic building as it was. Next slide, please. So a little bit more context looking further south, as well as at some of those row houses that are across the street. If we can go to the next slide. And then looking at the elevation here. So as mentioned, the monumental scaled church just to the north, and then we can also see the larger scale buildings to the south. And then our site right in here with the taller 3-story row houses that run along 6th Street. Next slide, please. So same elevation, but along L Street. So we can see the non-historic apartment buildings to the west here, as well as the Eagle building and then our site here. So next slide. So we can just run through these plans very quickly. So there will be the required parking that will be provided, as well as a gym that's planning on being in the basement. Next slide. So the ground floor will have 3 units and then retail in the existing historic building, but otherwise will just be public area and amenities for the building here. Next slide, thank you. So we'll also have a glass atrium, so that what we can do is we can set back the 7-story massing of the building from the smaller scaled 4-story row house massing here, which will give it a little bit more breathing room and allow the architecture along 6th Street to sit in more seamlessly in terms of massing, in terms of context. And then the 7-story building will be pushed back from 6th Street so that it reads more like it's primarily on L Street, responding to the taller buildings across the street. Next slide, please. So we can probably just cruise through the plans here, but you can see that there's a simple connection to the historic building, and then typical floor plans up above. Next slide. A small roof deck along the 6th story or the 6th Street side. And then next slide. And then this will just be the typical floor going up the rest of the building. So we can go to the next. And then the next, and we'll just be having a mechanical penthouse up here. So now we can look at the elevations here. So we can see that the building is trying to transition both in terms of style as well as in terms of massing, because as mentioned, we have a lot of 3-story houses along 6th Street, but then we have much taller buildings just across the street. So we're trying to go from 3 to 7 to 11 with the massing here. So what this does is this, since the existing buildings had taller floor to floors, we're able to put in 4 floors as opposed to 3 so that it feels like it's fitting in with the context. It's ever so slightly taller than the neighbors. And then the tower massing that you can see behind this is set back nearly 40 feet from 6th Street. So it won't really be visible if you're on that side of the street. And if you are on the other side of the street, it will be visible but not overbearing. And one thing to clarify, which we did add material callouts to this on the last slide, is that the 4-story row houses along 6th Street are intended to be entirely brick. The change in color at the top was to be a nod to something like a mansard, but also to change the material, which would still be brick, to the taller massing in the back, just so that we can sort of seamlessly transition between the 2 scales and the 2 architectures. Next slide. So then this would be the elevation along L Street, which would be larger in terms of scale. Instead of single-story punched openings, it's double height openings so that it can be a little bit bigger and more industrial to be, again, in communicating with the neighbor across the street. And then we can see the hyphen here between the existing historic building as well as the taller building here. And one of the reasons that we did want to set it back rather than seamlessly connect it as it may have been originally was because of the gable roof. And since we would be doing flat roofs here, we didn't want to kind of connect with that in a unsavory way. So what we did was we just wanted to pull it back a little bit and let the building read as an object. Next slide. So then this would just be the west elevation as mentioned, which just continues that architecture of the 7-story building around here, and then adds balconies for the residents. Next slide. So a building section through here, which again shows the setback of the building along the 7-story building from 6th Street, as well as showing the units that would be along 6th Street, and then the lobby and the atrium here. Next slide. And then a very similar section, but showing basically where some of the parking would go, and that there is a unit that would also be on the ground floor. Next slide. So here's the perspective of the image, or perspective of the building, which shows how it starts to transition up. And so as we remember, there's a 11-story building to the left here, and then a bunch of 4-story, 3-story buildings to the right here. So our intent here was to take the kind of simple traditional style that we have here create a quiet, simple addition to that along 6th Street with a 4-story building here, made entirely of brick, and then transition up in scale in terms of architecture and detailing up to a 7-story building. And so this piece here in the middle, the articulated eastern facade, is meant to tie together some of these geometries and proportions in a way that transitions from the 2 different types of architecture and the 2 different types of massing so that it can seamlessly fit in both with its direct neighbors as well as in terms of a larger context with the neighborhood. Next slide. And so here we can see what all of these materials would be. So it would be almost entirely brick here. All of the beige and the red that you see here would be brick or masonry. And then we would have a little bit of metal panels as well as metal detailing up on the tower. And that would be it. So I believe this is the last slide. Open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. While you have this slide up, you did mention that you responded to staff's comment about the 4th floor being this lighter colored masonry, this buff masonry. Did you say that you are changing that to the red tone?
No, so the intent with the change, it's the same material, but it would be a different color so that it's not exactly a mansard roof, but it's sort of a nod or a modern reinterpretation of a mansard roof. So rather than physically having the, slight angled setback, what we're doing is we're just changing the color here.
Okay.
So if you sort of get quick enough, realize it's not.
Okay, and then you described the 7-story building a few times as being, and I want to make sure I don't misinterpret your words, but quiet. And I would largely agree with you with the exception of that piece that's behind the 4-story building. What's your intent there? Why, if that's meant to, you describe that piece as tying together the 4-story and the 7-story, why the fins on that? And that's the part that I'm not understanding within this composition.
Sure. So the quiet comment, just to clarify, was more so just on the 4-story massing. So this was going to be a simpler building that would fit in with the other traditional context. The 7-story building, not quite as quiet, especially in that particular area that you had just called out. And so what those fins were doing was they were pulling some of the geometries through all the different facade studies that we did so that we could blend together the 2 different scales of opening. And so sometimes we're just using things like these metal fins that can pull some of these lines up and start to mesh together in this piece that's connecting the 7-story building and the 4-story building.
Okay.
Can I ask a question about that
Go ahead,
too?
Matt.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
so hi, Rob. The lighter color there, that's brick on that piece. Is that right?
Yep.
And the fins are metal and they're a different color. So the question I have is, like, it seems like the strategy, by the way, I think there's a lot of very nice things about this project, and
Thank you.
it does a lot of the moves, I think, well in terms of an infill building. I guess the question is, it seems like there's a lot of Technicolor gingerbread going on up there at that sort of, piece of the building, and it tends to call attention to itself in a way that maybe is somewhat overstated. And I'm wondering, did you all ever look at something else? I think what you're trying to do is make a distinction between sort of a piece that reads more as mass, which is the piece that fronts onto the street, which is heavier, it's got brick and things, and the metal panel piece, which is more of a kind of volumetric reading, And I'm sort of wondering, did you all look at something a little bit simpler there that maybe would it work as well in your mind if it was finless? Probably wouldn't swim as well, but it would work as well if it didn't have fins and it was a little bit simpler in terms of just reading as a kind of metal panel massing there that was distinct from the, I mean, I think I can understand why you don't want to make it all like the brick piece on the side street, because then it looks very monolithic there. And I think that's probably not in the character of that area. So I can understand the desire to make a distinction, but was there ever a sort of time where you guys thought, well, gee, you know, maybe it could survive being simple without the fins?
Yeah, we did quite a number of studies on this one, and the intent here was to kind of clarify the building on 6th Street and then the building on L Street, right? So it's two kind of discrete rectangular masses, and then this glassy portion was meant to be a bit more frame-like and kind of act like it's a grid starting to tie things together. So I think for us, having the frames and the addition made it feel less monolithic, as you say, and more like a connecting grid.
I mean, intent, I guess from my way of thinking, the intent seems clear. The realization of it, to me, is another issue. I think Marnique and I are headed down the same path here about whether you really need all that stuff there to do what you need it to do. Not to put words in your mouth, Marnique, but I think that's sort of what we're kind
Yeah.
of coming around to.
I'm right there with you. I just didn't use the Technicolor gingerbread term.
It's a very well-known term. I don't know why people don't
Yes,
use it more often.
I know. I should have used it. I will next time.
Madam Chair, I have a question if it's okay. Actually, two questions.
Sure.
If I'm seeing this correctly, and it's not very big on my screen, but the powder coated connector there on the front, you have it there, and then do you also have it on the side on the other elevation connecting that 7-story building to the historic building? Do they look the same? Or is the material the same?
Yeah, it's meant to be the same glass and metal connector piece.
Okay, is that actual connection? Like you're not going to be able to access the two buildings through that connector, or yes?
Yes, you will be able
You
to.
will be able to. Okay,
Mhm.
interesting. Okay. Thank you.
Other questions from board members? I do
Yes,
see.
good morning, everyone. I
Good
just have a
morning. I
quick
was just
question.
going to acknowledge you. Good morning, Sandra.
Thank you. I just have a quick question as well. On my screen, the building that's my left with the sloped roof that's being connected, is that a different shade from the other building? I'm at Matthew's gingerbread color now. I'm trying to, so is that a different shade of? Okay.
Yeah, so that's
Yes.
that would be the historic brick, and what we would be doing, since there's other red brick and other colors of brick along the street, what we would be doing is just a slightly different color so that we can acknowledge that we are obviously not historic, but we just wanted to acknowledge that and add kind of a variety of the same tone of brick to the street.
Right. The historic brick, of course, has a more muted and historic look to it. So I do
Mhm.
understand. I just was checking. Thank you.
Mhm.
So in the record, we don't have anything from the ANC. Did you meet with this ANC?
We did, and we got unanimous approval from them.
Okay, all right. They just haven't submitted a letter.
I will reach out to them.
Okay, if you could, it's always helpful to have that in the record.
Absolutely. Yep.
All right, and, okay.
I have just a couple of quick questions about the HVAC systems that you're planning for the units, both in the shorter building that's adjacent to the historic, but also the sort of mid-block building. Are you using the same system for both, and what are you planning to use to heat and ventilate? And then what will it look like on the facade, or will it all be on the roof?
Yeah, so it'll all be on the roof. It's going to be the same system, VRFs. Seems to be the plan here. But as mentioned, the penthouse will be mechanical, not occupiable. We'll need a little bit of equipment on the 4-story building just to supply those units, but otherwise everything else will be on the roof, screened.
Okay, so there'll be no venting through the facade at all. They're all
No,
going
no.
up to the roof.
It's all going up to the roof.
Yay.
Great. Right. Any other questions from the board? We don't have anyone registered to speak on this application. So unless there are any other questions, we would be ready to deliberate. Are we?
I'll start if you.
Go
if
ahead,
you'd like.
Gretchen. Mhm.
I think the overall sequencing of the massing and the idea of the lower connections to the historic building and the overall height that you have for the connections are good. I think it's way too many materials, and it's like your eye just doesn't know where to stop, and your eye wants to stop on the historic building, and the other buildings should be in the background. And it's just a lot of, you can call it gingerbread, you can call it multiple materials, but there's a lot of materials and a lot of detailing, and I think it just needs to be simplified overall for the project. But I'm okay with the massings that are shown, but just
Yeah,
too many materials. The historic building is just, it's a really calm federal flat front, so take your inspiration from that and do some beautiful flat front, related detailing. Just simplify it.
yeah, I would completely agree. Which I think is where I was going earlier with the fussiness of that piece, that transition piece, I get what you were talking about with the mansard, but I think that's just another material that adds to just more things happening here. So, certainly making that the same tone of masonry as the rest of the 4 stories, or the lower 3 stories would help. But I agree, simplification here would go a long way to making this stronger.
I have a similar view, although a slight distinction. The one that needs the most simplification is the piece we were talking about behind the 4-story piece. I'm actually fine with the building on the far left of this on, I guess is it on L Street that it fronts onto?
Some Yes.
updated details
that
show
a smaller patch for the 1 to 6.
Oh, there was some noise there. I actually think that's good. I find that piece, this accent color of the small panel to relate to the brick color of the historic building to be a nice move as a way to relate those two. I think the piece in the back behind the 4-story thing needs to be quite a bit simpler. But I'd be okay to delegating that to staff and letting staff review that. I don't think it could come back on the consent calendar or something like that.
Yeah. Any other comments?
I would just agree, Madam Chair, with the simplification of the back building as well.
Okay. All right, then I will make a motion that we approve the massing, the general massing of this infill addition with and ask that the applicant continue to work on the simplification of materiality, particularly, and I want to make sure, this was my thought, I want to make sure I'm interpreting the rest of the board in the same way. Simplification particularly of the number of materials and use of materials, less so in the 7-story building. At least I was fine with that, but reducing the number of materials and use of materials in the 7-story connector and the top of the 4-story building. Is that?
Sure, Heath. Sure, Heath, would you be amenable to adding that the historic building should really be the focal point?
Absolutely.
And the centerpiece?
Yeah,
And so whatever
absolutely.
simplification needs to happen to make that happen, I mean, it could be a reduction of materials, it could be simplification of detailing. These are pretty complicated windows. I know they have fresh air requirements for some of the windows as well with the new energy codes coming in DC. So I know there's some challenges that way, but.
What are we talking about? What do you mean by that? Because I'm not sure I completely understand. because the existing building is a solid, you know, red brick building on the corner there. Are we saying simplify the facade on L Street? Because I personally don't think that needs a lot of attention. I think most of the attention is on the 4-story piece, behind the 4-story piece. Is that what we're saying, or are we saying something different?
That's what I was saying. I think what Gretchen was asking to add was the reason for the simplification. Am I correct, Gretchen?
Yeah.
That the
And
reason
that it
for
may
this,
be that when they do that revision to the one elevation, that they decide to revise the other, so the building, the mid-block building reads as a cohesive building. I just don't want to constrain them to say, don't touch that elevation. The goal is the historic building is celebrated and the other buildings are, you know, don't detract from it, but are compatible, right? And right now, your eye hops around everywhere but the historic building because there's just too much going on.
Yeah, I actually just, you know, I mean, I think there's too much going on the one piece, but I actually find the infill pieces, street facing pieces there, actually, I'm okay with them.
Yeah, I just don't, yeah, I just don't want to constrain the composition, right? If they have to,
Sure.
if they simplify one and then the other becomes really busy, then they need to modify the other, but the goal is what I said, so.
Yeah, I think I can simplify the motion. But just, you know, through this deliberation, I think the applicant should understand that as it stands right now, the board generally likes the L Street elevation. You're free to change it as you work on simplification overall of the infill. But as it stands right now, I think that's a nice composition. The, and simple in its detailing, even though it has some character to it. The, so I'll simplify the motion just to say that the board is in support of the height and massing of the infill, but asks that the applicant make revisions to the number and use of materials in order to simplify the new architecture so that the historic building is more the feature.
Yeah, could we just add with a particular focus on the piece behind the 4-story? Not excluding the other pieces, but saying that that's the piece that has the most
Yes.
issue to deal with, it seems to me. I mean, I think you guys are right in that when you start changing that, you don't want a ripple effect that makes other things more complicated. But I think giving some direction on where the focus of the attention should largely be seems to me to be prudent.
Yeah.
And
I think they've heard that from us pretty loud and clear.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you have a question, Brendan?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Madam Chair. And can you just clarify in the motion whether it's delegated to staff or you want to see it on consent calendar?
I would like for it to come back for us to be able to see it. Seems that it could come back on consent since there's no opposition to it.
Thank you.
Sure. So the motion with the amendment to add that we're asking for particular focus on the 7-story connector piece. Any further discussion? And all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
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 Anyone opposed? All right, great. Well, thank you for this. It's a nice project.
Thank you.
Right, we're ready for our next application at 227 to 239 Massachusetts Avenue Northeast in the Capitol Hill Historic District.
Madam Chair, I will be leaving and I will return.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for letting us know. We'll see you shortly. Is staff ready to present?
Madam Chair, this is Tim Dene. I'm not the
Hey, Tim.
usual Capitol Hill staff.
No, right.
I don't know if Moira is available, but I will take over. perhaps we should have the presentation first, and then I could just make a few remarks.
Okay. Is the applicant ready? Is the applicant on?
We are.
Okay. Are you ready to make your presentation?
Yes. Jack.
Yes, good morning. My name is Zach Williams. I'm a land use attorney with Venable and representing the applicant today, along with our architects, Alice Arn and Roland Munoz. I'm here just to provide a quick introduction before turning it over to the architects. Hillsdale College is the applicant. It's a liberal arts college founded in 1844, based in Hillsdale, Michigan. It opened its Washington, D.C. campus at this location in 2010. The property at 227 Mass Ave, which you can see in the graphic illustration here on the screen, the tall three originally residential row home buildings, is what the college refers to as the Kirby Center. It serves as the local campus for the college, undergraduate students in the college's Washington Hillsdale internship program, and hosts other academic conferences and events. Hillsdale is now looking to expand its campus in DC, and not only at the Kirby Center, but also in the adjacent buildings located at 233 through 35 Mass Ave Northeast. Those will house what will be the graduate school of government for the college, and also provide additional space for the expanding campus. As part of this effort, the college is proposing several changes to the site, some of which are part of the discussion today. Earlier this year, the Board of Zoning Adjustment approved a variance to allow the proposed fourth floor extension, which is one of the components that's before you today. On the remainder of the items, I will turn it over to the architects, Alice Arn and Roland Munoz, to go over details of the project. Thank you.
Hi there. Thank you. My name is Alice Arn. I'm joined by Roland Munoz, and also our principal, Michael Imber, is on the line. I'm going to run through the drawings, and then we're happy to answer any questions and take any follow-up comments. So as Zach said, we're sort of treating this project in three parts. So there is an addition to the fourth floor that we have gone through BZA approval for and met with the ANCs. Met with the ANC on all of this, but for the zoning portion, we've met with the ANCs for the fourth floor addition. And then some facade improvements here at 227, these three brick townhouses, and then some renovations to the plaza. So next slide. Give a little background on the project. Next slide. So we're here just southeast of Union Station, along Massachusetts. Next slide. And considering these, this row of buildings basically here, so the three brick townhouses, the two siding townhouses that are light blue here, those we've already received historic staff approval for, the facade improvements at that building. And then the two brick buildings to the left, those, there won't be any work done on the buildings, but they're included in this because we are doing some updates to the plazas in front of them. Next slide. So this is just kind of a survey with some coloration to show the amount of green space in front of those buildings. This is all existing conditions. Could you go back one? Sorry. So just to give some context on dates, the rightmost building, the brick building, is 1892. The siding, the blue siding building, those are 1850s, 1852, I believe. And then the two brick buildings are both early 1900s. Next slide. And again. Oh, there's that slide. I'm so sorry. Next slide. Some Sanborn maps, we've kind of looked at the history of these buildings, really to understand the changes that have been made over the years. Next slide. Neighboring context. So we're right next door to the Union Pub and the condo building behind it. Across the street, is the Heritage Foundation and those kind of related buildings. And then on the other side next door is that small corner market. Next slide. So I'm going to start with the fourth floor addition. Next slide. So this is the plan we propose for the fourth floor. Currently, the fourth floor ends where that shading begins on the new massing, and we're proposing that shaded area, which is about 1,000 square feet. It's intended to be library space. It'll be a more formal library than they have now, so used for dissertation defenses, important academic receptions, and housing the college's pretty extensive library that a lot of it is in storage right now in Washington. There will also be some rare books displayed in the room. Next slide. I should say too that the mechanical area next to that addition is existing, as is the stair mass. So in section, we're proposing really just extending the massing of the fourth floor back towards the alley side of the building. Next slide. This is the existing front facade. Next slide. And the existing rear facade. Next slide. And here's just a screen grab of what's out there right now. So to the right behind that screen, that's a mechanical area, a large door opening to the existing library space of the building, some storage, and then a ladder up to the higher roof level. And part of this is used as a patio right now, and the rest is just gravel fill, separated with a railing. Next slide. So this is the proposed rear elevation. We do have a parapet coming in front of the facade we're proposing, but this kind of gives context. Much of this is existing. Next slide. And then this is the proposal for the rear elevation at that terrace. So it's really meant to just be a backdrop for a small outdoor space, keeping the materials really simple, just with plaster to match what's up there already. And then articulating just with a really simple cornice and pilasters. Really just utilitarian to kind of shed rain and break up the facade and create some really simple surrounds around those doors. Next slide. We did do some sightline studies here. The red dashed line on this plan view shows areas where there is no view whatsoever of this addition. And the orange sightlines show potential view corridors. The first along the alley along 2nd Street is pictured in the top right corner. I think you would grab kind of an oblique view if you were passing by that alley, but it's blocked by a tree and pretty well hidden. The other potential view is in front of the rectory at St. Joseph's. I think you would be able to catch a view, except that there are some really large canopied old trees right there. And you're kind of looking through a pretty narrow area between buildings. So I think it's essentially invisible from all of the street sides. And we have we've been in touch with all the neighbors and obviously the ANC on this, and notified them and talked with them. And we have several letters of support as well. Next slide. So moving on to the facade improvements at 227, so that 1892 brick building. This building it's obviously, I think you can tell in this view, and if you've seen it in person, it's a real gem along Massachusetts, especially the upper 3 stories are in really good shape and well preserved. And there's some really beautiful brickwork. Next slide. This is kind of zooming in. So where there have been the most modern interventions on this building is the ground floor. The stone base on that part of the building is pretty obviously not original. You get kind of a random stone pattern that doesn't really fit with anything historic on the hill. You also get really large door openings at the 2 side areas. So that bottom center picture shows what are some very much secondary doors, but they have large side lights and kind of strangely proportioned openings. You see also the upper center picture that kind of shows the terrace and the relationship between that terrace and the sidewalk. We've done some digging into the early history of this building and pulled the early building permits. And one interesting thing that comes from that is the building height is listed at 40 foot, which puts 40 foot between the top of building and Massachusetts Avenue, which means that the sidewalk and the road itself would have been at their lowest point where the terrace at the front door is now, probably 2 or 3 feet above that. And so there's very little about kind of the context that's original. The terrace is a much more kind of modern intervention. And it creates a condition, these large stoops attached to the front of the building that they now run a full height story from the terrace level up to the second floor. Those were added in 2010 when the building was renovated by the college. And they replaced something that was put in 1976. So those, when this building was renovated and to become a mixed-use building in 1976, it was offices above and restaurants or shops below. And they put in some concrete and brick and wood stairs that were very 70s, and these replaced those stairs. Next slide. So this is that building permit I referenced. Next slide. So the first part of our proposal is revising the stone base and replacing that kind of randomized, more modern stone with something much more in keeping with buildings from the late 1800s on the hill. One thing I think that will be important to us, it is probably the most important thing to us, is that we'd like to use something local and that would be typical of the materials on the hill. This picture also kind of incorporates, or this page incorporates on the top left image, we're hoping to replace the doors and fan lights on the second floor, which are currently not very good looking and definitely not in keeping with the character of the hill. So creating a more historic looking and more correct fan light, and then using stained wood doors throughout the second floor and the first floor. Next slide. This is that image from the 90s that shows the 1970s renovations done on the building. So you can see those stairs, those kind of masonry and wood stairs coming up, as well as awnings on the first floor of the building. Next slide. So just to describe our proposal, the first point is I've talked about the stone. I think we'd really want to work hard to find something local there. The doors on the second floor, we'd like to replace those and do something stained wood with a really lovely fan light to celebrate the kind of importance of that second floor entry on these townhouses. Another piece that is a new addition, so just the way this plaza functions and the building functions now, in 2010 when they did the renovation, they were planning to use the second floor entries as the primary entry. That has not really panned out because those stairs are treacherous. They're a little bit dangerous in all weather for kind of elderly guests and people who have accessibility needs. And in rain and snow, they're incredibly slippery and dangerous. So they are not used anymore. And really the first floor center entry has become the primary entry point for accessibility reasons, for security reasons. And we're proposing adding a canopy at that door to protect guests. That door is always locked, and so they find themselves waiting to be let in and need protection from the sun, the wind, the snow, etc. We're proposing something copper, a metal canopy that is really simple and kind of timeless in its design is our intention, so that it's not claiming to be historic, but it's complementary to the materials on the building already and kind of the character of the neighborhood. We've made it 5 feet deep to kind of provide that protection and also allow clearance to the ADA ramp that's just to the left of that. So the canopy is a big part of the proposal. And then the last piece is proposing replacing the existing stoops from 2010 with balconies that would allow us to still use and celebrate those entries, but eliminate the stairs from the 2010s. So those stoops, as I said, the last kind of evidence we have of those stairs is what was put in the 1970s and then what was put in the 2010s. It's not typical for those stoops to be a full height and to extend that far into the public space. As I said, probably terrace grade was a little higher, or street grade was a little higher than terrace grade now, and so they wouldn't have been that large historically. So we're sort of recreating a historic precedent that didn't exist and trying to put really large, long stairs there. So because the context has shifted, we're sort of proposing going a different direction and incorporating balconies to allow the full use of the public space and really open up that public area in front of the building. So with that, I think I'll leave it and we can take any comments or questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Before we take questions, Tim, is there anything you'd like to add in reference to the staff report? If Moira provided the report.
Actually, I'm so sorry. I think we have a little bit more on the plaza that I need to get through.
Oh, you do?
I stopped there and I shouldn't have.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll finish that and then we'll hear from staff.
So sorry. Sorry for the pause.
No worries.
So just a couple more slides. I'm sorry. So these are the existing plazas. Top is the plaza in front of the 227 building. The bottom right is the middle building, the siding building. And then the 2 brick buildings on the left are on the bottom left. Next slide. This is kind of an aerial view of all of those. So you can see the amount of paving at 233, 235, and 237 and 239. The kind of gymnastics they went through to get an ADA ramp up to an accessible entry up to the 233 building. And then really the impact of the stairs on the plaza in front of 227. Next slide. And this is a comparison between what's existing and our proposal. So some key things: maintaining an entry point for each of these kind of existing entries and not reducing the number, and maintaining kind of the memory of all of the property lines between these properties. So using site walls to memorialize those property lines and make sure we're still keeping distinct divisions between the 3 kind of groups of buildings. And then obviously incorporating a lot more green space. This is something we've worked with ANC on and the historic preservation staff pretty carefully and tried to kind of balance the circulation needs and really take advantage of the fact that we can create connections and reduce the amount of ramping on the site. But also address the kind of needs of the neighborhood and address really improving the site. It's very paved and not in great shape right now. So we're hoping these are improvements that benefit the neighborhood as well. Next slide. So this is the elevation of that kind of area along the street. So the important thing to note here is we are maintaining the existing terrace grades at each of these areas because of the slope of Massachusetts. We do find ourselves with retaining walls, but those are all just 2 or 3 inches taller than grade just to hold the terrace level. Using larger columns to mark the main entry point to this kind of public space, and really create kind of a welcoming entry. And then using simple, they columns that kind of those 2 points flanking the main entry, really to just receive site walls. Those have been minimized significantly just to kind of allow us to terminate those site walls. So with that, I will leave it for comments and questions. Excuse me, pausing early in my presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So now we'll hear from staff.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The addition proposed appears not to be much of an issue, so we won't discuss that further unless you wish. It's very important, the selection of the stone at the basement level. It should be a brown stone or a red sandstone complementary to the red brick above, especially if we're evoking the Victorian architecture. Rendering it red a little yellow, and we just want to make sure, yellowish brown, and we want to make sure that it is indeed complementary and typical of the late Victorian era. The reconstructed basement level openings on the bays flanking the main entrance would be better reading as windows, that is to say, smaller openings. It's a little confusing to have door-like openings, and it'd be more in keeping with the solidity of bays as they come to the ground to have smaller openings. It may be the case that the right-hand one needs to be an egress door because there appears to be sort of a lounge area behind it, but that does not appear to be the case with the left-hand one, which seems to be crossed by one of the ramps and its railings. Retaining the primacy of the original entrances is an important principle, but one could certainly argue here that the damage has already been done with the lowering of the grade. The stairs are not original, and they're, in fact, ill-proportioned and difficult, and removing them would free up space below them. Otherwise, functionally, they're probably just a place for people to sit. The green space, the green area behind these walls should be maximized. The site work is a substantial improvement, especially for that ramp sort of in the middle of the site, getting rid of that. But the walls and the piers still maintain a real substantial barrier and a perceptible division of the public realm. And the enclosure of a lot of it is privatized space. We would recommend that at least 2 of the piers be removed because they're a little bit arbitrary and it's unclear what they're doing except sort of trying to bookend the privatized space. It's probably acceptable to have the piers at the entrance, although they need not be as high. And the walls themselves, it would be good if, unlike today, they're not necessarily come up sort of above the height of the paved level behind them. That it actually steps down so that you have a planted area that slightly slopes toward the street to open this place up a little bit and not have this sort of barrier in the middle of the the public realm, excuse me. That is our report.
Thank you. Do board members have any questions at this time?
Yeah, I have a question for Tim. It's Matt Bell. Where's the property line? Is it at the back of the sidewalk or is it further deep into the site? Do you have any idea on that?
Yeah, it's at the buildings. So
It's at the buildings.
Yeah.
So-
So yeah, so it's a deep piece of public realm, but it's divided, and I just think public or private would be better opened up. And I don't think that means necessarily major interventions, but if some thought could be given to maybe not sort of leveling everything out on the horizontal, but sort of gently sloping down the planters that are furthest toward the street, and kind of revealing that planting and just lowering the wall entirely, taking, and then maybe
So
adjust
Tim,
it.
sort of like a thing you see in other parts of the city where you have a ground plane that meets the street by having a sloped berm
Yes.
that
yes.
comes down to the sidewalk or to a smaller wall in some cases.
Yeah, I'm
That
thinking a
is what you would
smaller wall.
recommend.
Yeah, frequently you'll see sort of a quarter round concrete curb, and I don't think you have to go down as low as that, because in some places you have issues with the steepness of that and maintaining the slope depending on the vegetation you planted. But I think somewhat so that you're sort of you're sort of not having to look over the wall at the plantings, but you're sort of looking at them kind of arrayed on the slope.
But a couple other thoughts about that. So that tends to be, in my way of thinking, a strategy for areas that are more residential in character, right? Where you have that sloped berm.
Well,
planted berm.
that's true,
Right.
but that's true, but you typically don't have either in residential or in commercial areas. I'm getting some feedback over here.
Yeah, can, someone mute?
When's availability, the July date?
Still getting some interference.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, but typically in the commercial areas you have zero barriers between the
Right.
buildings and the street, and so it's sort of the introduction of the barrier suggests to you that you then make that as sort of low and humane as possible.
Is it though, is it also possible, I mean, is it the applicant's intention that this area be used by the public in general or for the students as part of the college? Maybe they could weigh in on that.
In greater detail, knowing that.
I think the primary intention is that it become a place where the campus can gather, but it's also open to the public in the same way it is now. One challenge just that we've faced as we've worked through this is we have fairly intensive stormwater requirements. And we have to treat a lot of stormwater in those green spaces.
Right.
So that's just something that we'll have to work through if we think about terracing. It's a challenge to get the square footage and,
Sure, for the
get all the
green area
planters
ratio,
connected
sure.
and
Yeah,
all
yeah,
of
of course.
that. So
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Mr. Bell, I mean, your question about residential versus commercial. I mean, this is originally residential that's changed to commercial and now being changed to sort of a institutional, mini campus. And so I think that it doesn't necessarily suggest a particular solution, but but I think just simply dealing with this grade is what necessitates probably not reinforcing the change in grade, but sort of easing it as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, that it started residential clearly, and like a lot of places, like on 17th Street in particular, where buildings were converted, there's a different character today, and now, as the architect has pointed out, there are certain, stormwater requirements that clearly this area can help to solve, and at the same time, make it feel like something that is, while not necessarily a public plaza, is something that participates in the public realm in a positive way, that if a non-member of the college wanted to go sit there, they wouldn't feel alienated by the design. I think that's what you're saying, Tim, about it.
Well, yes, but I think it's also just the experience of walking down the sidewalk and having a barrier to your side, and the wall is low enough that a person can see over it, but it's not. It would feel a little more comfortable and a little more open and inviting and I don't mean necessarily inviting to come, tell you to sit down, but just visually open and inviting if it could step down a little bit.
So, to sort of summarize that a little bit, I think what I hear you say is they can have a wall because they need that distinction, that sense of boundary, but they might consider maybe piers with some pickets or other things that could make it seem a little more visually open that would, because I think to my way of thinking, I think the idea of the wall to define the boundary of the sidewalk is probably a good idea. It's just sort of how you execute that.
Well, I would put it this way, I think you need the wall to deal with the grade still.
Right.
But
Right.
basically cutting it down a foot across, across the site and sort of gently sloping the planter areas would just feel like it opens it up a lot.
And
So
Tim,
then you sort of have a knee wall rather than something that's coming up to your chest.
how high is the wall relative to the human being at the highest point? I could ask the architect that.
We're
Like in the
about,
elevation we're looking at, the
I
elevation.
think the highest point is in front of the center building, the graduate school building, which is 233, 235, the siding building. I think
Right.
that's about 36 to 42 inches.
From sidewalk or from the terrace on the inside?
Let me zoom in quickly.
There is a ramp in front of,
Yeah.
half of that.
It looks taller than that. I don't have the.
Yeah, it might be 42 or 48. I'm sorry, I don't have that number.
If you were to count, if you were just to count the risers on the
Yeah.
the entrance,
Yeah, I see,
you
yeah.
would say that makes up most of that height that's been, that's got to be, what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 risers at 7 inches or so.
Yeah, so 42
So
or
that-
a little bit around there. Yeah.
Right. So that's taking you not much above the plinth of the piers.
Tim, are you saying that this right-hand side is really what you're trying to get after?
What I'm saying is look at every wall that's in the public space and see to what extent you could lower it while just having a gentle slope on the planter box behind it.
Would it be helpful?
Can I ask one other question?
Yeah, let's go to the plan.
Can we go to the existing image of the site conditions on there?
There's a good plan that's got existing plaza and proposed plaza. It's page 26, I think, at least.
That's right there.
That's it, yeah.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
But how it reads in plan and how it reads in elevation is very different, I think. And even if you go one block up on Capitol Hill, there is rarely a place where there is a barrier a wall that is 42 inches or greater in height. They're all much lower than that. And they're either lower brick with metal on top. And that is more consistent with the Capitol Hill Historic District. I don't think we should be talking about other historic districts. It's not Mount Pleasant with berms or with nice walls, stone walls. That just doesn't happen on Capitol Hill. And we're talking about compatibility within this historic district, right?
You're right. I think one of the things we're trying to do is conservatively maintain the existing grade there. If you go back another slide, you can see contextually what we're really looking at here. You see, so right there, that is our terrace elevation. So those are our site walls. You can see the graduate school, the bottom right, that's the height we're looking at. So we were just trying to maintain that without regrading the whole terrace. So contextually, we're just trying to streamline that. But Tim, are you saying you would like us to terrace the grading from the front of the building to the
Yeah,
street?
I was saying sloping. If you go to the site plan, the proposed site plan, there you go. So you'll see that in almost all cases you have a considerable depth of the planted area, and so that allows you to sort of gently slope down, not to a point where you've got a steep slope and you really have to worry about retaining the soil, but just enough to sort of lower the wall and kind of reveal the plantings to somebody walking by.
So Tim, if we had where you see the back wall of the ramp.
Yeah, sorry, I'm addressing the board right now. I don't really suggest I'm not going to get into a recipe for fixing each area. That's just the general point, and I I apologize for not having been more articulate about it. But the idea, yes, I think that some of the piers are sort of random. They appear to be signals of where corners are, but that's kind of unnecessary to put this imprint of this building out in the public realm. And we understand the sort of idea of signaling the entrance, so piers there, maybe not as tall, but piers there seem fine. Elsewhere, we absolutely understand the need to retain the higher grade that's behind this. But we think, sort of as you see where the stairs come down, that the slope could sort of slope down a little bit in those areas. And that's my prescription. I probably won't get more detailed than that.
Can I ask a question of the architects on this? And Tim, your opinion of this is helpful too. The ramp in the center that's more or less that connects the 233, 235 building to 227 that comes off the sidewalk there.
Yes.
Is that necessary because in that location? Because one of the things that is a little bit odd about the wall is that it seems to have this sort of ramp hidden behind it and break. And I'm wondering, is there a solution where that ramp migrated to the far left of the plan, where the grade is shallower, so that the treatment across the front could be more consistent? In other words, if that ramp was to the far left of 237, 239 there, then the treatment across the front and some of the things Tim's talking about how that grade gets navigated in the walls and things, seem to me that it would ease some of that sort of herky-jerkiness in the plan, where you have the wall sort of stepping here and there and up and down and things. Is that a possibility?
So the reason to put the ramp right there is the area in front of 227 is the lower terrace.
But you have a ramp next to the building there, right?
You're talking about the ramp in the center? So the ramp that's right up against the building, that joins the two terrace
Right.
levels, basically. And
Right.
the reason that the ramp closest to the sidewalk is where it is it allows you to take advantage of, number one, the higher sidewalk grade to the left of this plan, but also the lower terrace grade in front of 227. So if you shift it over, that ramp has to get longer because the terrace is higher, basically. Does that make sense?
No, not yet.
So
Wait, so the ramp against the building connects 233 to 227, right?
yes, and 227 is the lower terrace level. And so if you
Right, I
scoot
understand.
that
Got it,
ramp
but I mean,
over, you're losing
but
24 inches, basically.
not when I look at the elevation on the far left looks taller than, I'm a little confused, I guess, because I'm seeing that that Mass Ave is rising up to the left, and that ramp, were it to go into the site on the far left side there. In other words, you have you can walk from 237 to 227 without encountering steps, because you have a ramp against the building between 233 and 227, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I
So,
was muted. Yes.
so I guess what I'm wondering is why not try to make the center more consistent and put that ramp that connects the sidewalk over at 237, so that then you can satisfy the requirement of being able to move continuously from 237 to 227 and get rid
Yeah,
of
the
that
only way
ramp.
we could do that is, if we keep the entrance in line with 237, that it would have to go, it would erase that memory of the boundary between the buildings. It would have to happen in between those two buildings there.
And it would also just be significantly longer because of the height of the
Oh, I see what you're
taller or
saying,
the
because
higher terrace at the
227's lower. Okay, so
Mhm.
I guess what I was
So we
thinking was
gain
whether
24 inches basically and lose
right,
24 inches of ramp.
right. Well, I was just wondering if the slope of Mass Ave made up for that. In other words, it looks like you pick up a couple of risers as you move, to the left there, whether it would be a wash or not.
You're sort of 12 or 18 feet of ramp more if you push it to the
That
left.
much, huh? Really? That much?
Yeah, it's because you have 24 inches between the two terraces roughly. And so suddenly you have a much longer ramp that's harder to,
So-
and you can see in the existing elevations, the kind of ramp length necessary to make those grades work if you push it to the higher terrace. Sorry, it's a long explanation.
Yeah, I mean, the staff reaction to that, I think, is simply that it has to go somewhere, and it's roughly in the location of the ramp today, but it takes up less space, so it's a net positive. We haven't worked out the geometry. I mean, it may be that moving it left would improve it slightly, and I'm hearing that's not the case, but what it does is it makes it longer from that entry point to the main building entrance.
That is another thing that we kind of liked about that ramp placement was it's more central. And so it feels like a part of an entry, that accessible entrance.
Mm-hmm. And did, Tim, to your way of thinking, do the yards have to be treated similarly? It looks as though there's a desire to make the paved areas generally equal in each of the areas in front of the separate buildings there. And I'm sure some of this has to do with green area ratio and stormwater and whatnot, but is there any kind of thought, Tim, you all had about whether the main entry ought to have a little bit, I guess it does have a little bit more paving, but read more as a kind of plaza, and the other ones read more as sort of yards?
Yeah, I think just generally we'd like to see as much green area as possible, and that sounds like that is consistent with the need to retain some water. I think that in the ideal way to look at it would be for each sort of front yard to relate to the building behind in some way and sort of be composed as if it were one unit rather than the whole being one unit or it all just sort of be randomized. It's obviously there's with the circulation, there's some difficulty with kind of laying out the ideal garden you would want. But having some, having sort of the idea of unity within the zone, there appears to be sort of actually setting up kind of two zones, one signaled by the pier that's on the left and a wall that goes back to the building. So the applicant seems to be kind of separating that out to some degree. But yeah, I mean, ideally, as with the building, you would compose the landscape in such a way that it kind of had sort of formal composition and unity, but would relate to the buildings behind it.
Right.
And but again, a lot of this is what's your experience when you're in the space and sort of sitting down within it. Our principal concern is with what's the experience of all the thousands of passersby every day.
Sure.
We're certain that it can be a nice space for the users, the most specific users of the college. But we sort of want to open up that experience to people who will not tarry there sitting on the benches.
So a question for the applicant, one other question then, is the principal entry that you've made with the new door at the plaza level, is that the entry that everyone is going to be anticipated to use? Is that generally going to be it? Or these other doors you're showing on this drawing up here, are they going to get equal use or significantly less?
I think they'll get less use. I think it'll be students and faculty who are going into those individual buildings, and the public will go through that center main entry.
Okay, thank you.
I think the other thing about the size of those paved areas and those two locations is when there are assemblies, we have a large number of people that are going to be using that space.
Mhm.
And the other, there's a little bit more paved space in front of the middle building, 233 and 235, and that's primarily because of those bays. We've kind of taken our cue from the width of the opening at those bays and not wanted to put paving and planters or put planters in front and kind of
Mhm.
squeeze that, you know. It kind of creates a tightness there and would bring planter right up to the front door.
Although those bays are only, what, a story tall, right? They're not as prominent as the ones on the 227 building, right?
Yes.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting little problem you have here.
Thank you.
The little mess that needs to be unknotted.
Yeah. I'm sort of intrigued by something Tim said about, and Gretchen said about the grass front yards. And I end up wondering whether it's possible to make a bigger distinction between 237 and 233 as being largely planted and shaded with trees, if you could do that, and 227 that might be a little bit more paved and shifting the green space around so you get a hierarchy of how it relates to the principal entry. Right now, it seems very kind of even-handed at one level, and I'm wondering if there's a way to sort of take the question about more green front yard in the buildings on the left and more plaza in the building on the right, have them meet at the sidewalk in a way that deals with the wall issue that Tim cited, but has a little bit clearer hierarchy about the entrance and the design of all that. Because it right now, when I look at this plan, it looks like you're trying to get people into the entries in the same way, with the same level of hierarchy for each of those doors. And while I think you do need the street access and the steps and things, it seems like the yards could begin to give a little bit more variety there. It's just an off the cuff reaction.
Right. We do have several people who are registered to speak, so unless there are other questions from the board now, I'd like to hear from them, and then we can come back to board questions before we deliberate. The first person that I have registered is ANC Commissioner Joel Kelty, representing ANC 6C05. Is Commissioner Kelty on the line? We also have single member district Commissioner Mark Eckenweiler.
I'm
Chair Heath, this is Juliana speaking. Commissioner Kelty is on the line.
Okay, is that who I hear speaking? We can't hear you now.
It looks like Commissioner Kelty's line is still muted.
Hello.
Okay, now we hear you.
Good morning. This is Commissioner Joel Kelty representing ANC 6C, and just have a couple brief comments regarding the project. We met in May and reviewed this project. We actually reviewed it a couple of times at the committee level and then with the full ANC. And the committee, the ANC voted 6-0 to support the project with qualified support. There's a lot to like here, but we did have a few comments. There was unanimous support for the rear addition as being not inconsistent with the context. We appreciated the applicant's agreement to reduce the front entrance canopy down to 5 feet projection from the front facade. It was originally quite larger, and we appreciate their working with us on that. One thing that hasn't been discussed much that we did emphatically oppose was the removal of the existing stairs. And while we understand that those stairs are not original fabric, we feel that the stairs are critical to understanding the typology of these three buildings as row buildings. And while they're all interconnected now, we still want them all to read as though they were three individual buildings. And on that basis, we think that the removal of those stairs is inconsistent with the Historic Preservation Act. We understand that the applicant feels that those stairs may create visitor confusion about where the entrance to the building is, but with the canopy being added to the front at the main entrance, we think that mitigates any chance of confusion, and that there may be other things short of total removal of those stairs that the applicant could do to signal that those stairs are not functional entries. Like the staff report, we really feel that the wall along the sidewalk is probably too low and probably too high and could and that those the piers flanking the main entry at 227 should probably be lowered. And lastly, we had a design suggestion, which was that the planters flanking the main entrance canopy have the corners be chamfered so that they're so that the planters step back from the posts supporting that canopy. We think that'll improve circulation and also limit debris and trash collecting between the planters and those posts. Thanks for your time. That concludes our comments, and I'm available if you have any questions.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions for Commissioner Kelty from the board?
No questions, Chair Heath, but just a comment to say thank you so much to the commissioner for organizing and focusing on the topics that are purview and specifically talking about the preservation components. That was very, very helpful. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Okay, now Commissioner Eckenweiler. Are you on the
This
line?
is Juliana speaking. Commissioner Eckenweiler is not on the line.
Okay, all right. Then we'll now hear from Beth Purcell with Capitol Hill Restoration Society.
Hi, good morning. My name is Beth Purcell. I'm testifying on behalf of the Capitol Hill Restoration Society. Really our only issue at this point with this case is the row houses, which each have an original second-story entrance, which is currently reached by metal stairs, which are not historic. The HPO's publication on door repair and replacement, preservation, and design guidelines says that blocking up or creating new openings on a primary elevation, such as this, of historic buildings is not appropriate. And while these stairs are not the original 1892 construction, they serve an original function as entries to historic row houses. The applicant seeks a more institutional experience and proposes to remove all three metal stairs, and in the process abandon the original second-story entrances, leaving them in midair, and thus significantly altering the perception of these historic buildings as row houses. So for this reason, we believe the project at this point is not compatible with the Capitol Hill Historic District. And thank you for considering our comments.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Purcell. Any questions for her? Okay, would the applicant like to respond to any of the comments from the commissioner or Capitol Hill Restoration Society? I know none of these came as a surprise given their
Yeah, I guess, what we've struggled with is the typology between having the upper level entry points to the townhouses and the typology of having full height stairs, which is not a historic typology in Washington D.C. What we have is normally the road level or the plaza level would have been higher, creating a historic condition with stoops, and these are no longer stoops but long stairways, which is an oddity historically. So that's been our struggle with this. Not to mention that that they impede on the public space extensively.
All right, so any final questions from the board? All right. Then now would be an opportunity for the applicant to make any closing statement if you'd like. Before the board deliberates. Okay.
Thank you. I think we're
Thank you.
appreciate your comments and the discussion.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, so would anyone like to start deliberation on this? It seems like most of the discussion has focused on the entry stairs, stoops, and the courtyard space, this front space. One question that I'm not sure was asked, did you all, and this is to the applicant, you all have not gone to public space yet, correct?
We've done a PDRM with the DDOT staff and gotten their preliminary feedback, but it's been indicated to us that that will happen as a part of the permit process. So once we submit for permit, we'll do a public space hearing.
Okay, all right. Okay. So would anyone like to start from the board?
Well, I'd be willing to start with a few points, Chair Heath, if you'd like, and then maybe continue the conversation from there.
Okay.
I think on Massachusetts Avenue and in other streets within the Capitol Hill Historic District, it's more common that when the row houses are reused, that even if they retain a single use and across multiple properties, there's some distinction that is retained for each of the properties to have their individual identity. I think Matt Bell was talking a little bit about it too, in terms of not treating all of the properties exactly the same. I understand the desire for identity, but maybe there's some repetition with environmental graphics or signage that could help and assist that. But having some more respect for the individual unique character of each of the buildings and the fact that they are individual properties historically within the district is respected and continued in other locations on Capitol Hill where there have been conversions from residential to institutional uses of a variety of functions. And so I would encourage the applicants to look at that and consider that design. I agree with the commissioner and the CHRS in their comments about the removal of the stairs that go to the second story of the row house. There are a number of solutions like this that exist within the Capitol Hill Historic District. It is not odd for stairs and porches in the Capitol Hill Historic District to be in public space. I live in Capitol Hill and my stair and landing is in public space. And all of my neighbors, the property line is the front face of our house, and all the remainder to the street is public space. So it's very common to have that happen. It is a bit unique to have come in at the second story, all the way from the first story. But there are some locations in Capitol Hill that have that because of the grade changes that happen. So I think that it's important to find a solution that retains the stairs and then also recognizes a little bit more of the individual character of each of the properties. So it doesn't feel like one large plaza unifying all three so they're the same. Even in some of the elevations, I noticed that it wasn't presented formally to us, but on page 22 of our packet where they talked about the treatment of how they were proposing to change what were the second story, the original doors into the row houses, that the building adjacent is being painted to look, or proposed likely to be painted to look like red brick, to be more unified with the two other flanking red brick buildings rather than leaving it painted or painting in a distinctive color to make it look like three frontages. I don't have any comments about that. It's not before us, but I think it's more appropriate and more compatible within the historic district to retain that, because Otherwise, it will read like one large scale building, and that is very not usually found within the historic district, and I would say not compatible to have one contiguous long frontage like this, to be one singular long building within the Capitol Hill Historic District.
Thank you, Gretchen. Those are all great points. I completely agree. And they all speak to the need for the individual character of the residences to remain. Anyone else have other?
Yeah, I have some comments and some different thoughts here. I agree that the building to the side should not be painted a color to match. I think the question about signage that unifies the campus is a good lesson. We've seen that in places like GW, where the signage tells where the university buildings are, so that could help. I guess I am not of the opinion that the stairs absolutely need to stay, and I think actually this is a very artful transformation of and solving that problem by putting the main entrance at grade. And I don't find that the stairs, while I can understand they're part of a kind of language of row houses that one finds around here, I think the benefits of not having them far outweigh the benefits of keeping them. If the plazas and the spaces outside, the plaza outside, was configured, I think, a little more succinctly and a little more clearly. I think the elevation with the new entrance is nicely done. I think the two windows on either side that Mr. Dene was talking about the base, seem a little bit overly modern in a sense that they're just simple cuts, and I wonder if there's more detail that ought to be supplied around those ground level windows that would be in character of a row house of this type. So I'm sympathetic to the facade proposal. As for the plaza outside, I think it is possible, I think, to do something which has perhaps more grass in the areas of 237 and 233 and make those more relate to those buildings, and maybe make 227, since it is an entrance, the main entrance now, perhaps something that had a little bit less grass and a little bit more plaza, to make an individual distinction of each of those yards to go along with each of the individual townhouses as they historically evolved. The height along the wall height along Massachusetts Avenue, I have no problem with the piers and things. I think the visibility could be studied, and maybe some exhibits could create it to help us understand exactly where head level is and things, to sort of engage the public realm. It would be nice, there are walled gardens in this city that have nice gateways that people go into. I'm thinking of the one, right by the old Columbia Historical Society. I know it's on Capitol Hill, so Gretchen's going to jump on me and say it's not on Capitol Hill, so that doesn't
I am.
go here,
I'm
Matt. I
talking about
understand.
compatibility with the
No, I
Capitol Hill
understand.
Historic District. Yeah.
I understand. Gotcha. I'm trying to just preempt you there. That's all.
Okay. Fair enough.
No, but I think that's something to be considered. I do think the visibility into this is important. I think a wall is important as well. Maybe some further consideration of the height of it, and maybe some way in which the landscape green could roll up the grade a little bit could help. But I think there's probably a little bit of study there that could. I think a wall there does provide a sense of boundary and a space that isn't, while 100% public, it certainly is part of the visual field of the public realm. And as this institution presents itself to the street, is important. And I think that's something that perhaps could be improved upon. So I think there's obviously the addition of the rooftop is not an issue. There, it's nicely done. It is interesting that when I first looked at the elevation of this, I thought this when I'm looking at page 27, I'm looking at the proposed street elevation. What's nice about it is that in removing those stairs and putting the entrance the way they did, it sort of looks like it was designed as a unified building. Now, I know that goes against the idea of reading each individual townhouse, but I think there's some leeway here about transforming this into something else, if it's well done, that we ought to seriously consider.
Okay.
Hello, this is Board Member Jones.
Matt, I'm kind of opposite of you. I definitely feel like it reads too much like one unified and not uh, three separate townhomes. And I know that is kind of the point of this proposal. But I also think that ends up being problematic. I don't know if there's a creative way to maybe reduce the stairs or I'm not sure what can be done, but I do think it still needs to read as three individual uh, townhomes versus one kind of independent building, kind of connecting, because it does take away from it. And I just, for me, looking at page 27, I kind of get that. I like the idea of creating the courtyard. I like the idea of unifying all of the spaces together um in that, but I do still feel like the three buildings need to kind of maintain um that aspect so that they were individual homes that are being pulled together to create this one cohesive piece.
All right. Any other thoughts?
The only other thing I add, and just so it's not not spoken about, I don't have any problem with the addition on the fourth floor. I think it's a good solution. It's not visible or minimally visible. So I think I'm fine with that. I think it's a creative solution.
Right. Yeah, I was going to ask that question because no one had mentioned it, and I assumed that meant that we were all fine with that. So, any other thoughts anyone has? If there are no others, then I will make a motion that we approve the fourth floor roof deck and rooftop addition, and ask that the applicant work with staff to address the comments from the board today on the facade improvements, entries to the residential buildings, the stairs, the plaza, and generally, support the board's strong feeling that the individual character of the residential buildings needs to remain. And ask that once you've done some more work with the staff, and I would also add the ANC and Capitol Hill Restoration Society, because I think they've both given very thoughtful comments to each of these points, that then you come back to the board to review those revisions. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Okay, great. Then any further discussion?
If you'd oblige the staff just for a moment.
Yes.
It would seem to us that a really key consideration here is whether the stairs stay or go. And I know that sort of makes it the tough decision to make, but I think that it's gonna make a difference of obviously how you lay out or relay out the landscape. It's obviously it sounds like there are different opinions on the board. There are even different opinions on the staff. There are different opinions, it sounds like, from the civic organizations. But it seems like that really has to be addressed probably now, in my opinion. And obviously, it is a tough question. Sort of the primacy of the original openings is important. It's really important. To be honest, if Moira were here, she'd be fighting for keeping the stairs more, because we had that discussion. I abhor the fact that the grade was changed in the first place and all this stuff was built. And I sort of feel of the feeling that maybe the damage has been done. And while the stairs are a signal pointing to the original entrance, that you sort of notice the stairs now more than you do the entrance. And so, but that's just my opinion. And I've heard the opinions of the board, but I think that's a really essential question to answer at this point.
I think, you know,
Yeah.
Matt Bell's position and my position, Chair Heath.
Yeah.
Well, let me just say one other thing. What I think ought to be considered here, I mean, the the nicest piece of that ensemble with the stair is actually the facade piece that goes with it, which is staying, which one could have imagined you would have had maybe on a piano nobile of one of these buildings, whether there was a stair there or not. And I guess I'm troubled by the fact that we are being adamant about keeping stairs that actually will not be used. And
Well,
I
they
think
should be
that's,
used. Why wouldn't they be used if they're retained? They
Right.
should be used.
I mean, even
But
a
It's like
I
having
mean,
a
I think
front
they're
door
not going to
that's
be.
not
I
a
think
front
actually,
door.
but I don't think they're going to be used if they have a ground floor entry. You know, even
Well, you don't
even
know
if they
that. I
keep,
mean, they could use that. We don't know that. We would encourage them to use the door. I think historically we've opposed blank doors being not used for their function, right? There are a number of projects that have come before the HPRB where the plan changes and they propose to leave the front door but close it permanently. And we've encouraged people to use those functionally. So I would encourage them to keep the stairs and use the doors. They may not be
well,
the primary entrance, but
it's an easy
functional.
transformation of the door to a window in this case. I mean, I think it's something that looks rather harmonious, I think, with the facade.
Perhaps, but within the context of historic preservation and compatibility within the historic district, it doesn't meet the requirements of the code, and it changes the understanding and morphology of the definition of the building and the way that it functioned as a row house.
Okay, but if what you're saying then, Gretchen, is that if it's against, is this a demolition that should go to the mayor's agent then? Is that what this is? Because
No.
in the end of the day, if we're saying the stairs are historic and part of the character defining features here, isn't that what we would have to do?
But these stairs in particular are not character defining. Having a stair in this location would have been seen as character defining had this been original, right? It's hard to argue that this is a character defining feature as something that was added on later.
Well, 1970 puts it within the period, right? 50 years, but not to make us all feel old, but but you're correct. Having a stair that leads to that door at that place in the design of this building is part of the character defining features and the elements. And so having it be a window, not to state the obvious, but a window is not a door, and the functionality and the way people ingress and egress people should have that ability to continue to do that, whether it's the primary in the proposed renovation or not, means of egress, ingress and egress. Is up to the applicant, but having those stairs running up to the door still is a primary function that
Oh,
defines
wait, so we're
the architecture of the
arguing,
building.
but we're arguing to keep a very recent stair that by most accounts is kind of ugly and intrusive to the building, right?
Well, that
That's
may
what
be
we're
your
saying.
opinion. However, I think they're very compatible with the architecture that's there when I walk by them probably almost every day because I live a couple blocks from here. But in any case, we are not arguing to keep something that is there. We're arguing to have the functionality of a stair leading up to a door, which is part of the original architecture that's common in the vocabulary of the Capitol Hill Historic District and along Mass Ave. That's what we're
But
arguing about.
it is within our purview then, if the stairs are not historic, and although you may disagree with me that you want the entrance there, it would be in our purview to say, if everyone agreed, it wouldn't be out of our purview to say the stairs could go away if we so deemed it, right?
If they wanted to put new stairs back so that people could get
So
to
they would have
their-
to put new stairs back then.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna suggest as an alternative. You know, if there was a new configuration that worked better with their plaza design, the idea of having this maintain its character as and use as an entry demands that it has a stair, right? Doesn't have to be this stair. but there needs to be a stair there. That's what I would
So
support.
by law or by opinion? That's what I'm interested in knowing. I mean, we have discretionary powers on this, correct?
Okay, yes, you do. I'm not, I'm not an attorney, but as staff with some experience, I think the board could find it compatible or it could find it incompatible. The board can also balance alterations with the adaptability interest, to adaptability to current use. That is also one of the purposes of the law. You know, as I've expressed my opinion, it's not that clear cut a thing because of the alterations that have changed, and there are just competing values here.
I mean, if you go by the adaptability to current use, I think this is a very sensitive design.
However, it's not compatible with the door, as CHR correctly notes, the door repair and replacement preservation design guidelines as they provide that expanding or reducing the size of door openings, blocking up or creating new openings on primary elevations of historic buildings is not appropriate. Flexibility
But
to
we
this
have
principle may be,
discretionary.
flexibility to this principle may be
Right.
applied for basement door openings located under stairs or otherwise not prominently visible from public view. I think it's the prominence of this on a major L'Enfant Avenue being consistent with the vocabulary of the Capitol Hill Historic District to have stairs leading up to openings when they're slightly above grade. Yes, the grade has been changed. Yes, the stairs are new. But still now 50 years old new, right? But still having that functionality, I think, is an important part of the vocabulary in defining these buildings, and changing those to windows, I think, dramatically changes the intent and design of this historic landmark building. It would not be consistent with our preservation guidelines.
Yeah.
And if we were bound to the Secretary of Interior standards, would not be consistent with the Secretary of Interior standards. However,
But the thing cited though about the change in the grade of the plaza and the introduction of the new stairs and things like that, we do have
really great
discretionary
design
powers,
challenges
though.
that you have to deal with as a preservation architect to be
Right.
compatible. Yep.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
So, I think to Tim's point, I will, I don't know that, I think this is the part that we may not all obviously agree on, but I will add to the motion that, the doors remain, entry doors, and usable, as that function necessitating the need for a stair. And I'll leave that open to the applicant to decide if they want to keep this stair or replace it with another compatible stair. But that would all be a part of what comes back to the board with the revisions of facades, plaza, entries.
But we're saying 3 stairs though, right, Marnique?
Yes.
Not just stair, we're saying 3 stairs.
Yes, at each of
That's what
these
your
doorway
motion's saying.
entrances.
Right,
Yes,
okay.
correct.
Okay.
Yes. At each of these entrances, correct. So I've amended the motion. Can I get another second?
I'll second.
Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Is anyone opposed?
Opposed?
Okay, so we have one vote in opposition from Board Member Bell. All other board members, Heath, Beatty, Baylor, Jones, and Auerbach are in support. Just to be clear, since this is a split vote. Did I miss anyone? Okay. Great. Well, thank you to everyone for your participation in this hearing today. I think it's a complicated little problem, and required this level of discussion and debate. This is great.
Well, thank you for your thoughtful responses.
Sure. We're ready to hear our third application for the day, which is at 3522 Quebec Street Northwest. Would staff like to make your report first?
Good morning, Madam Chair. This is Ann Brockett, and I would be happy to give the staff's, to summarize the staff report. This is a bungalow built in 1924 as one of a pair in the Cleveland Park Historic District. It's typical of a bungalow, has a prominent front porch with battered stone piers, a low-slung bungalow roof with overhanging eaves and exposed rafter tails, as well as a front-facing second-story dormer. The plan is to remove the existing rather small rear porch, that's 1 story, and construct a 2-story addition that extends about 21 feet from the rear wall of the house. The addition would be inset 6 inches on each side, retaining the existing corners of the house. And the roof would be a cross gable to the house's primary side gable roof, and it would be set a couple of inches below the existing ridge line. The addition would feature shed dormers on each side and would continue the stone foundation and horizontal wood siding that's found on the existing house. The windows in the addition are proposed to be single light casements. We have reviewed this, and the design has been amended several times in response to the HPO comments as well as those of the immediate neighbors, and the overall height, size, and the inset have all been adjusted and amended to provide a compatible design. The windows on the original portion of the house have been revised to be compatible replacements for the existing windows. So the staff is recommending that the board find the addition to be compatible with the character of the Cleveland Park Historic District and to delegate final approval to staff.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Is the applicant ready to present?
Yes, good morning. My name is Eric Turan, and I'm the architect for the homeowners at 3522 Quebec. So as staff just reported, we've worked for the last 2 or 3 months with the neighbors, ANC, HPO, to get something more compatible. We did originally start with about a 28-foot addition, and we've come back down to 21 feet. And as you can see on this first slide, this is lot 18 and 19, and we're proposing to do that 21 feet and coming in 6 inches on each side. Can you go to the next slide, please? So this is the existing basement, and then we're adding a new bonus recreation room. Next slide, please. This is the same basically floor plate as the basement, where we're adding 21 feet to the back. You can see the 6-inch indentions on each side to separate it from the existing structure, and just opening up that area. Next, please. The next slide, please. Oh, go back one more, please. There you go. This is the new second floor, where we're adding to propose where the primary suite will be located. As you can see, the first half of the existing is staying almost as is, except we're adding that corridor to get back to the bedroom number 1 and adding a bath 2 for the 2 front bedrooms. Next slide, please. This is the roof plan. We were able to get the new roof to be, I think it's 4 inches lower than the existing gable, just to give it that separation. Next, please. And so here you can see where the existing is on the left side, and that's remaining untouched, except for replacing the existing windows with the same style, just with new windows. And the right side is the addition. And there you can also see the new roof is a little bit lower than the existing gable. Next slide, please. On the left is the rear addition. So, we're also the last, I think it's 1.5 feet where you can see the gable where it's steeper. That provides a little bit of a bump out, and it helps a little bit with the shadows. And it kind of stays with the main, the overall look of the house. And on the right is the front elevation, where we're not touching anything except just replacing other windows with new windows to match the existing. Next slide, please. And this is the side elevation where the existing, you can see, is to the right and the new is to the left. It's very similar to the facade on the other side, on the east elevation. We are changing the windows there you can see in the middle, where we're going to put new windows in the existing bump out, just to make it feel more like a sunroom. It's not visible from the street, and there is already vegetation that does block it from the neighbor's house. And the next slide, please. Just sections. You can kind of see with the building section 2 how the roof is kind of, you know, we can't go any lower to separate the new and the existing. We tried to get it as low as we can, and I think this is probably as much as we can. And then to the right, just that'd be the section through the new part of the house. And next slide, please. And these are just the existing plans. You can go, I think there's 2 more slides if you just want to go through them. Just showing what we're demoing, and that'd be the existing second floor. And I think that's it. I don't know if you have site photos if you want to look at those as well, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, great. Thank you for your presentation. Any questions from board members at this time? I did have one question for you. Hopefully you can answer this, but the Cleveland Park Historical Society had issues with the scale of this addition, and I'm wondering if that was before you made the revisions?
Yes, that's, I think we were, when we presented him, I think it was at 23 feet still. So we made the addition, or we made the revision afterwards, and then we presented to the ANC.
Okay, it's the ARC is who I'm referring to, but the ANC, I assume their letter was after you made the revisions because they are in support of the size and scale, but the ARC was not. So I was just trying to get an understanding of the timing.
Correct.
Okay, all right. Okay. We do have one person who is registered to speak, and that's somebody who submitted testimony into the record. So I'd like to be able to hear from Mary Johnson, particularly, you know, if her issues still remain given the revisions that you've made. So is Mary Johnson on the line?
I am. I don't know if you want me to go on video. I'm happy to do so. I'm just not sure how to do that. Okay, great. As long as it wasn't something on my end. So thank you very much. My name is Mary Johnson. I live in the Craftsman style bungalow immediately next door to 3522 Quebec Street. As was mentioned, our houses are the only 1920s historic bungalows on the block. This is my first time engaging with the historic review process, and it's not a way that I am comfortable doing, but I'm doing so for 2 reasons. One is that the size and the scale of the proposed addition are disproportionately large to the site and the neighboring historic properties. And 2, that the evidentiary record in this matter is incomplete and misleading. In a historic district, size and scale matter. And as I've said to the homeowners, I do not object to an addition. However, the size and scale of this proposed extension, 21 feet deep by 24 feet high by 26 feet wide, are disproportionately large relative to the lot and to the immediate neighboring homes. The Cleveland Park Historical Society, ARC, examined nearly identical massing for this project. And I attended that meeting, and my recollection was that it was the same depth of 21 feet. It was the height was differed by inches, and the sides didn't have the 6-inch indent. The ARC concluded that the size and scale of the proposal quote, overwhelms the existing house, its yard, and the neighboring bungalow, unquote. And they've asked to review a revised proposal. Indeed, the addition of this magnitude would result in a 2-story, 21-foot deep expansion that literally overshadows my adjacent home. And for more detail, I just refer you to attachment 1 of my written testimony. If we lived in the suburbs or in areas with bigger lots, then an addition of this size wouldn't matter. But we live in a historic neighborhood on modest sized lots and in homes that are set close together. Consequently, a large addition such as this has a substantial impact. In this regard, it's important that the Historic Review consider not only whether the proposed addition can be seen from the street or the alley, but also its relationship to the site and to the bordering properties that are most affected. For these reasons, I ask, as I did of the homeowners, that the depth of the addition be reduced from 21 feet to 16 feet. While still a sizable two-story addition, this 5-foot decrease would make the massing less overwhelming to the site and to the immediately adjacent historic homes. In the review process, the integrity of the evidentiary record also matters. And the DC Advisory Neighborhood Commission's resolution to move this case forward to the HPRB was based on an incomplete record that gave a misimpression of the amount and nature of support for the addition. The resolution referenced 1 letter of conditional support and 10 additional letters of support from neighbors. These documents were not distributed to the ANC commissioners for review prior to a vote, and they weren't included in the record of the proceedings. Most of those letters were actually short emails that simply expressed general support for the concept of an addition. This collection of emails did not include the homeowner's originating email request and thus lacked important context regarding the question posed to the neighbors. And at least 3 of those neighbors were not aware that their informal emails would be submitted to support a historic review application. They had interpreted the homeowner's originating email as just a courtesy note about planned construction. Notably, a neighbor across the street who had responded to a second request from the homeowners and described to them the benefits of their own 4-foot addition, detailed the importance of considering the impact of a large addition on the immediately adjacent homes. She had thought that her letter would be submitted to the ANC reviewing officials, but it was not among those reviewed by the moving commissioner. As the next door neighbor most directly impacted by a large addition to 3522 Quebec, I've done my best to engage in the historic review process. For example, by taking time to give written and oral testimony to the ANC. Despite my efforts and absent my letter to you yesterday and my testimony today, there's scant evidence of my participation or perspective in the written record before the board. It amounts to 1 line in an ANC resolution that notes simply a, quote, objection to the design from the most adjacent neighbor to the east, unquote. Moreover, the recent HPRB staff report incorrectly suggests that the current plan reflects my input as one of the immediate neighbors, and it does not. Many of my Quebec Street neighbors have known me for decades. Significantly, they know me as someone who is welcoming, kind, easygoing, and fair. It's an understatement to say that speaking on this issue today is outside my comfort zone. However, what I've learned over the past month navigating this review process is that if I do not speak for myself, my reasonable concerns risk being misrepresented, diluted, or dismissed. Midday yesterday, the homeowners informed me that their architect is in the process of revising the design to reduce the addition's footprint. For the reasons that I've stated today and my written testimony, I respectfully ask the board not to approve the size and scale of the current plan, but to defer action on this matter until after the Cleveland Park ARC and the HPO staff have reviewed the revised design that will be submitted. I also urge re-examination of the review process leading to today's meeting. Input solicited from neighbors should be relevant and specific to the architectural plan, with greater weight given to those directly impacted. Likewise, such comments should be sent directly to the reviewing officials so that it is clear from the record that those offering input have done so with the knowledge and intent that their views be part of an official proceeding. Finally, neighbors' input and other relevant evidence should be examined by each of the decision makers prior to a recommendation, should be addressed in a balanced manner, and should become part of the public record. I very much appreciate and thank you for your consideration.
Okay, thank you for your testimony and the testimony you submitted into the record. So I'll just ask the applicant, the proposal from your neighbor of reducing the size of the addition to 16 feet rather than 21 seems pretty reasonable. Before I dig into that, are you requesting any relief from BZA for this? Any lot relief, rear yard?
No, nothing with the BZA.
Okay.
By right.
So this is all matter of right, okay.
Yeah.
So have you looked at a solution that considers 16 feet rather than 21?
So just real quickly, the ARC, what they saw was 24 feet by 27 feet. So they haven't seen this 21 foot. But we have looked at the 16 feet and we've spoken to staff as well. To push this back another 5 feet, then we'd be messing with reconfiguring the back of the roof of the existing house, in order to get the same allowable square footage, because the existing roof, the gable, it's all very low ceiling height, as you can see from that one section I provided. So we'd have to basically remove a lot of the back part of the roof. I know the owners are okay with doing this. We just don't know if HPO staff would be okay if we're removing a lot of the existing roof. So we're open to it.
Okay. All right.
And the neighbor could fill you, the owner can fill you in as well. He's on the phone about the neighbor support and any of that stuff that he had direct interaction with, if you'd like.
Okay. And what would be your thought on reducing? I wasn't sure that the rear roof would need to be manipulated, the existing house, to do that, just to remove 5 feet of the addition. But what's your thought there?
If you could go back to the second floor plan, I think it's page 7 or 6. One more, 5. That was close.
I would say, since this question is directed to me,
yes, thanks.
That the addition has already been reduced and the interior space has already been pulled in from, I believe it was 28 feet initially. The staff 100% feels that this is a compatible addition. It is typical of board approvals throughout Cleveland Park. We do not feel it overwhelms the existing house. We do not feel it overwhelms the site. It's certainly within what is allowable. So I would not suggest redesigning from the dais in terms of the numbers of feet, but voting on the issue that is before you. And if that vote comes back that it needs to be resubmitted, then that would be the next step.
Okay, all right, thank you. Questions from the board? Any questions? Okay, all right, then seems that we're ready to deliberate. We want to turn cameras back on. I see most have their cameras on. I think Ms. Johnson has made some compelling requests here, but The reason I asked staff, given that the applicant has already reduced this addition pretty significantly, I would be in support of the staff report. And what we've heard from Ann today to maintain this addition at its current 21-foot depth. Does anybody have any additional thoughts on that? Disagreement?
I'm in agreement.
I'm in agreement with you, Madam Chair.
Okay, all right. Then I will make a motion that we approve the proposed addition at 21 feet. And ask for a second.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Right, anyone opposed? Okay, then the motion carries. Thank you to everyone for your participation. We are ready to proceed with our last case of the day in the DuPont Circle Historic District at 1322 to 1326 18th Street. This is coming back to the board for another review. And I'll allow staff to make your presentation, and then unless you'd like to start with the applicant, you let me know.
I would be happy to go first, Madam Chair. If we could just go to the next slide, just so the board knows which project this is. Yeah. And you'll probably remember it. This is a project that you reviewed in March of this year. And at that time, you asked the applicant to consider ways to reduce the visibility or disguise the addition that's proposed as a 5th and a 6th floor on this set of 3 contiguous row houses. The proposal responds by adding a mansard roof as a method to camouflage the addition. And this does lower the point at which the roof form springs off of the addition, but it actually raises the height of the addition. So the overall visibility has been increased. And in the HPO's opinion, does not improve the design's compatibility with the historic buildings. Other than replacing the 1/1 windows that were previously spec'd with 6/6 windows, 6/1 windows, the proposal is essentially the same as what the board previously reviewed. It is the opinion of the staff that the design does not go far enough in order to reach a level of compatibility with the historic row or the historic district. The HPO continues to support a setback 5th floor, no 6th floor, and we seek the board's input on the previous staff recommendations, which are consideration of adding a front door in the bay of 1326, which is inconsistent with the board's preservation and design guidelines for basement entrances. The exposed brick sidewall of 1326 should be retained as it steps down toward the rear. The historic vestibule materials, which include lovely stained glass transoms and original front doors, should be retained. The use of brick should be considered on the first 4 floors of the addition where it is exposed to view. Any prospective rooftop mechanical equipment should be depicted on the plans and in elevation so that they can be evaluated. And at 1322 18th, which is the property to the far left, we request that the original size of the main entry should be restored with compatible doors installed rather than infilling the opening with windows. So we are seeking the board, we are recommending that the board approve a 5-story addition set behind the original block of 1322 through 26 18th Street with the condition that the revision of the project for permit adequately addresses the comments above and delegate final clearance to staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Is the applicant ready to present?
Yes, I am. Good afternoon or good morning, board. My name is Sean P. Sean with PGN Architects, and yes, we were here in March presenting this project to you. We do have a full package of information here. I will not take you guys through each sheet in detail because it's stuff that we've already gone through. What we really wanted to come back to the board to discuss was the 6th floor addition. We are proposing a 5th and a 6th floor addition to the building. And we have made some adjustments from the vantage points that are visible to add in mansard roofs and a decorative cornice to allow for a transition from the vertical addition of the building to an angled roof material, and then thus transitioning to the sky at that point. We can go to the next slide. Just to remind you guys, this is along 18th Street, where our building sits in context with a number of similarly sized buildings along 18th Street. And then it transitions to a commercial corridor along Massachusetts Avenue, where there are 8-story plus buildings, and setting a scale along Mass Avenue that is a very different context than the context that we sit in along 18th Street. And I would like to also remind the board that we did present to both the ANC and the DuPont Conservancy, and we received full support for our proposed addition as is. Can you go to the next slide, please? Again, this is showing the buildings in context. As I mentioned, the buildings along 18th Street are similar size to the existing three row houses, and then it transitions to the larger buildings along Mass Avenue. Next slide, please. And this is just showing more context. We can go through these pretty quickly. Next slide. We're preserving the majority of the existing row houses, all of the structural walls. We are punching through at a couple of areas to add some connectivity to the addition, but the majority of the walls are being retained, and are adding in an additional bay projection that was formerly removed and dormer to the roof. Next slide. You can continue going. Next slide. Next slide. All right. Next slide. So these are the floor plan and additions. As you can see, we're adding in a number of units and some vertical circulation, 2 stairs, and an elevator. Next slide. Again, next slide. And then once we get to the addition at the 5th floor, it is set back from the facade of the existing row houses, and including a green space out in front of the addition. If you go to the next slide. And then at the 6th floor, the front of the building, it steps back even further. And this is where we begin to introduce the mansard roof. If you go to the next slide. So in elevation, materiality, we selected materials that would blend with the existing buildings. The existing buildings will be painted in a white color, the brick, and the materials being added to the addition are also in a lighter color to help the addition to disappear from the elevation. If you can go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Here at the side elevation, this is where you can see the mansard roof that was continued around from the front to the side towards the back. And it allows us to transition that corner. I think previously what we had was a pretty sharp edge that that didn't have a transition around to the side elevation. So here, this mansard continue around to the side, improves the massing of the building as it turns to go back towards the rear of the building. If you go to the next slide. This is just showing it same elevation and color. Next slide. And from the sight lines, you can see that we originally started with the mansard at the top of the building as a way to reduce the visibility of the 6th floor addition when seen from across 18th Street. So this sight line shows why that mansard and the nature of the mansard shape and scale of it, where it was derived from. The next slide, please. The building materials are similar to what we presented before. I won't go through in detail all the materials, but we did add in a detail of the mansard, proposed mansard roof and cornice as seen down in the lower right-hand corner. Next slide. Again, another view of the addition and more detail. Next slide. So we have a series of renderings that we have done to depict the building in context. Along 18th Street, I think we went through this last time, there's several buildings that are of similar scale. And from this vantage point, the addition, the 6th floor addition is minimally visible from the across 18th Street. You can go to the next slide. Again, this is looking, and we're just proceeding up 18th Street. Again, looking at the building from the front, you can see the mansard roofs and the effects that it has on helping to reduce the impact of that 6th floor addition from this vantage point. You can go to the next slide. Next slide. Now the visibility becomes apparent when you go towards the north and begin looking back towards the building. But again, I would stress that from this vantage point, we're in context with 8-story buildings. So the massing of the addition feels to us appropriate in terms of the 6 stories versus the larger scale buildings that are to the north of our building. Next slide, please. This is another from across the street, 18th Street, showing the same vantage point, and the continuation of the mansard around the corner towards the back of the building. You can see the effect of that 6th floor transitioning from the vertical to a horizontal, to the roof line, and the impact that has turning the corner as opposed to just being a hard stop edge at that vertical corner. Next slide. And then as you go towards Mass Avenue, when you have there is a vantage point from Mass Avenue that between the existing buildings along Mass Avenue, where there's a vantage point where the buildings are visible and the addition is visible. If you go to the next slide, we did a couple of photo montages. One of the concerns that we heard last time was that there was some modeling of the existing buildings that were kind of out, not as detailed and not showing a true vantage points. So if you go to the next slide, we've updated that massing, and then to the next slide, we've also created some photo montages that show it in true context. If you go to the next slide. So here's the first vantage point from the corner of Mass and 18th Street, and you can see the 8-story commercial building in the foreground, and then our building with the addition in the background of that. And from this point, we're approximately 150 feet away from our building and along Mass Avenue. If you go to the next slide. Another vantage point from the sidewalks on Mass Avenue, looking back towards our building and the visibility. In context, again, with the 8-story commercial building. Next slide. And then across Mass Avenue at 18th Street, the visibility of the addition begins to get blocked almost in total by the adjacent commercial building. Next slide. So this is a viewpoint from across Mass Avenue, further back where the visibility is there, and we're approximately, we're 250 feet away from our building, but you can see the visibility of the 6th floor addition, stressing the context of the adjacency next to the 8-story commercial building. We looked at the compatibility of that massing adjacent to the 8-story commercial building, and the addition of the mansard roof allows us to soften that edge of our the top of our addition to blend a little bit more into the skyline, as opposed to what we had previously as a very sharp edge there. That mansard helps us to transition from the vertical to the horizontal. The next slide. And another thing we wanted to stress is there was some conversation in the last meeting around what the vantage point is from Mass Avenue. So we did a walk, basically a photo walk up the street to show what the context is. Along Mass Avenue is a very heavily trafficked street, very tall building walls on both sides of the street. Next slide. And then at a certain point, right before you get to 18th Street, that transition, that there's an opening and aperture that allows some visibility of the buildings along 18th Street. But again, this vantage point, from this vantage point, you're contextually looking at a commercial corridor, and the buildings towards the rear of that commercial corridor are sitting at a much lower scale and in context to the 8-story commercial building wall along Mass Avenue. Next slide. Thank you. But that concludes our presentation. I did want to add that we focus on the transition of the 6-story addition as our primary focus. We did study a number of different options when looking at it from the Mass Avenue vantage point. There were several options that we looked at, and to be quite honest, the options of changing either shape or massing of that sixth floor, none of those options really presented an improvement to what we thought was already a pretty decent massing in context with the 8-story buildings along Mass Avenue. So what we're presenting today is a compromise of the top massing being adjusted to allow for a transition from the vertical to the horizontal. We did also respond to the addition or the change of the window treatments from to a 6/1 window treatment. And we've also gone back and made sure that we have some very accurate photo montages that really present this in context. So we would like to hear from the board your thoughts and opinions about our presentation, where we stand now.
Okay, thank you. Anne, I actually have a question for you before the applicant. Your staff report makes it clear that you support this addition being 5 stories. I assume that means you are opposed to 6, that you find it incompatible. And I'm curious if you could just expand on that, given their proximity to this really massive building that shares a side with them, or that they back up to.
Sure. Yeah.
Just curious about that. The rest of the context along 18th Street makes sense with keeping this at 4 or 5 stories, but this is an unusual condition here.
I'm not sure it really is all that unusual. It is due to the fact that it's one lot in, or one building in, from a major avenue, which has a wider, the width is substantially larger than 18th Street, and therefore the building heights can be bigger, taller by code. And the context of Mass Ave is very different than the context of 18th Street. What we didn't look at is the buildings next door, which are modern construction, are the same height as the existing building. So if you looked where those trees are on this image, they are in height, they are relatively the same as what's shown, as are the buildings going down 18th Street. Directly across the street is a 2-story building. I think it's an addition to the building that you can't see. Well, you can see just the roof edge of it at the far left of this photo, which is also a residential building. And I think it's important from a historic perspective to keep the sense of the history of DuPont as a residential neighborhood, which developed along Massachusetts Avenue as a commercial corridor and a business corridor, and actually more of an institutional corridor. So I think context is important, and it is in the context of the fact that 18th Street is largely commercial today, and the taller building on the right of this photograph, that we would be comfortable with the 5th floor, which is visible, which we wouldn't normally support in a residential district. So we did take context into consideration. I just don't see how a 6th floor, even if it were designed completely differently, could be, and set this far forward perhaps, could be considered compatible with the row houses underneath it. And that does take into consideration the tall building on one side. But if you do look at the existing context and the size of these 3 row houses, the staff does not support the 6th floor.
Okay, thank you for that. Other questions from board members? Any other questions?
Chair Heath,
yes,
if you and perhaps Gretchen, I'm returning, so I apologize for missing most of it. But I heard your question, Chair, about the proximity to a building that is out of character, if you will, for 18th Street, and not necessarily understanding the reason why a 6th floor would not be supported. Could you just say a little bit more about the response from that? Did that satisfy your question as to why it would not be supported?
It did. It satisfied mine. Did you need more? Did you need to have more of an explanation of that? I mean, what I heard from Anne was, you know, the scale and character of Massachusetts Avenue is much different than 18th Street. And that is certainly what allows the building on Mass Ave that this backs up to be of the scale that it is. So rather than look at its neighbor and the mass of that building next to this one, staff is really looking at the character and scale of 18th Street and the context of this building to its neighbors along 18th, which should respond to the scale of this street, not to Massachusetts Avenue. Does that make sense?
That provides the clarity that I needed. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. All right. Any other questions? All right, then I think we're ready to deliberate on this. Do any board members, I mean, I think the issue before us right now is this 5th floor versus 6th floor question. And I'm curious if any board members disagree with staff's position here. Right, I hear no disagreement.
I don't, Chair Heath, I don't disagree. I'll be positive. I agree with staff's position. And I didn't hear anything in the testimony or see anything in the materials that were provided, largely because they were consistent. And I agree with staff's position about the mansard roof.
Okay, all right. Okay, then I will make a motion then that we support the staff report.
I'll second that.
Okay, so there's been a second. So any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Anyone opposed? Okay, then the motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Pichon.
I'm sorry, I thought I was going to get a chance to speak again.
Oh, well, there wasn't anything for you to rebut, but normally we would have given you a chance to rebut any testimony. But I'm not sure if any, you're more than welcome to add a final comment if you'd like. I'm not sure if that will change the board's.
Yeah, I just wanted to go on record and to reiterate the fact that I'm hearing the discussion around context along Mass Avenue versus 18th Street, which is exactly what we were responding to. If I think our vantage point from 18th Street, we are in context with the surrounding properties. The visibility of our addition is very minuscule when you're looking at it from the 18th Street corridor. It's when we go to Mass Avenue that the visibility becomes an issue, and thus we're looking at it from the context of the commercial corridor, which was clearly stated, and we agree with that. There is a change in scale to Mass Avenue from 18th Street, and I think the vantage point is where we have our struggle, in that along 18th Street we're actually fitting in character. It's only because we're opened up to Mass Avenue that we have an issue with the scale, and now that scale has, from our perspective, is in context with the surrounding Mass Avenue scale, not the 18th Street scale. I don't know if that helps or hurts, but I just wanted to stress that again, that we are responding to the 18th Street as we're going along 18th Street. Is when we get to Mass Avenue that we have an issue of scale.
Yeah, I think, my thought on that is the siting of these buildings doesn't help you, certainly with the alley being next to you. So having that, that opening there along the side of your building gives greater visibility. If you were in the middle of this block, you probably could get away with the 6th floor, maybe. I think you'd have a better chance there in trying to disguise this than you do given the alley siding adjacent to your building. So I think that's what's really hurting this. We have to look at every site as its own unique condition. And that's what makes this one unique and harder to find the 6th floor compatible.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you taking my final comment.
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. And if we, certainly, the board is always open to revisiting a vote, but I just, unless somebody else disagrees, that was why I felt this was the right decision.
Thank you.
Right.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for participating today. We'll see you later this month. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.